text for this morning is Job chapter 6, found on page 516 in your Geneva Bible. As you're turning there, I'll remind you what we've covered so far in chapters 1 and 2. Job was afflicted by Satan, but he is a righteous sufferer. He's not suffering for any sin he has committed. It is not the wrath of God poured out upon him. And in chapter 3, Job made great complaint. And he wishes that he had never been born. And he says many violent things, cursing his own existence and life. In chapters 4 and 5, one of the three comforters that have come to comfort Job, his name is Eliphaz, makes a speech. And in that speech he accuses Job of using too much violence in his words and not having a right understanding of God, and accusing him of being a wicked sinner and a hypocrite, for he can see no other cause of Job's suffering than that he's a hypocrite. And now here in chapter 6 and 7, Job is going to answer Eliphaz's charges against him. This morning we'll look at just Job chapter 6, the beginning of his argument against Eliphaz's charges. Job chapter 6, verse 1. But Job answered and said, "Oh, that my grief were well weighed, and my miseries were laid together in the balance. For it would be now heavier than the sand of the sea. Therefore my words are swallowed up. For the arrows of the Almighty are in me, the venom whereof doth drink up my spirit, and the terrors of God fight against me. Doth the wild ass bray when he hath grass, or loweth the ox when he hath fodder? That which is unsavory shall be eaten without salt, or is there any taste in the white of an egg? Such things as my soul refused to touch, as were sorrows, are my meat. Oh, that I might have my desire, and that God would grant me the thing that I longed for. That is, that God would destroy me, that he would let his hand go and cut me off. Then should I yet have comfort. Though I burn with sorrow, let him not spare, because I have not denied the words of the Holy One. What power have I that I should endure? Or what is mine end if I should prolong my life? Is my strength the strength of stones, or is my flesh of brass? Is it not so that there is in me no help, and that strength is taken from me? He that is in misery ought to be comforted of his neighbor, but men have forsaken the fear of the Almighty. My brethren have deceived me as a brook, and as the rising of the rivers they pass away, which are blackish with ice, and wherein the snow is hid. But in him they are dried up with heat, and are consumed, and when it is hot they fail out of their places. Or they depart from their way and course, yea, they vanish and perish. They that go to Tema considered them, and they that go to Sheba waited for them. But they were confounded when they hoped. They came thither and were ashamed. Surely now are ye like unto it. Ye have seen my fearful plague and are afraid. Was it because I said, Bring unto me, or give a reward to me of your substance, and deliver me from the enemy's hand, or ransom me out of the hand of tyrants? Teach me, and I will hold my tongue, and cause me to understand wherein I have erred. How steadfast are the words of righteousness, and what can any of you justly reprove? Do ye imagine to reprove words, that the talk of the afflicted should be as the wind? Ye make your wrath to fall upon the fatherless, and dig a pit for your friend. Now therefore be content to look upon me, for I will not lie before your face. Turn, I pray you, let there be none iniquity. Return, I say, and ye shall see yet my righteousness in that behalf. Is there iniquity in my tongue? Doth not my mouth feel sorrows? You know, there's very curious things that have been said there. We'll try to unravel all that Job has said in those words so we have a right understanding of Job's defense of himself and exactly what he's getting at. Title of our message this morning, Job chapter 6, verses 1 to 29 if you have a Geneva Bible, verses 1 to 30 if you have a King James Bible. I don't know why one has one more verse, but it's the exact same words regardless of what version you have. And this is called Job's defense against Eliphaz. Our introduction. In the last two chapters, Eliphaz, one of Job's friends who came to comfort him, set forth a charge against Job. Based on Job's loss of prosperity, he wrongly concluded that Job had secretly sinned. Eliphaz warned Job against those who put forward hypocritical and false testimonies. It was, of course, an error to accuse Job of hypocrisy. But to make matters worse, Eliphaz had built his whole argument from this faulty ground that Job had sinned. So, we look at our 3 points this morning, verses 1 through 7. Job defends against the charge that he cannot comfort himself. Verses 8 through 23, Job defends against the charge of wishing for his own death. And verses 24 through 29, or 30, Job defends against the charge that he denied God's justice. Our context. Job seeks in the next 2 chapters to vindicate himself from 3 false accusations of Eliphaz, who also represents the thoughts of his 3 friends. First, Job defends against Eliphaz's charge that he was a comfort to others, and now he can't comfort himself, a charge he made in Job chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. Secondly, Job defends himself against the charge that he spoke out of anger and envy when he said he desired to die. That was in Job chapter 5, verses 2 through 7. Thirdly, Job denies that in his speech, the speech that he made in chapter 3 actually, he challenged the providential will and justice of God. Job knows that like all men, he is a sinner. But he is required by the 9th commandment to defend himself against false charges and to reject the poison of foolish earthly wisdom. He must defend himself. We come to our first point, verses 1 through 7. Job defends against the charge that he cannot comfort himself. Verses 1 to 3. But Job answered, he answered Eliphaz, and said, "Oh, that my grief were well weighed, and my miseries were laid together in the balance. For it would be now heavier than the sand of the sea. Therefore my words are swallowed up." Job immediately recognizes that the words of Eliphaz misdiagnose the heart of the problem. If only Job's friends could understand the nature of his suffering, they would understand the violence of his language. Eliphaz and the 3 friends might be able to sympathize with Job's burden of material loss, but they have no understanding of what Job has been suffering psychologically. Job says if his troubles could be weighed on a cosmic scale, there is nothing that could be placed opposite his grief on this scale to demonstrate a balance. Since nothing, Job says, can compare to his grief, he suggests here the weightiest of all substances. Job suggests that if all the wet sand from all the beaches of the world could be brought into one place and placed on the other side of the scale, his grief would tip the scale against the sand. His grief would outweigh the sand. Job hopes by supplying this picture of the weight of his griefs being such a remarkable burden, so that his friends can begin to understand why he spoke so violently about his miserable life and his desire for death. His grief is so great, he says, that he cannot explain it or he cannot articulate it in words. Therefore, he says, his words are swallowed up. Verse 4, Job goes on, "For the arrows of the Almighty are in me, the venom whereof doth drink up my spirit, and the terrors of God fight against me." For the first time here, Job mentions God by name, calls him the Almighty, and openly admits that his affliction is from the hand of God. Of course it is. Job rightly refers to his troubles as arrows, because like arrows, they come out of the air swiftly and suddenly, without warning. But these are no ordinary arrows. They contain venom, poison that saps Job of his vitality. The venom, at least in the mind of Job, is the wrath of God. As ancient nations used to dip their arrows in poison to kill the enemy, so Job likens his misery to arrows that have been dipped in the wrath of God. He further amplifies this war imagery by likening his terrors to being pursued by a well-organized army with a zealous general. That's what he means by the terrors of God fight against me. It's as if the terrors are soldiers and God is the general of an army of terrors fighting against him. Verses 5 through 7 says Job, "Doth the wild ass bray when he hath grass, or loweth the ox when he hath fodder? That which is unsavory, shall it be eaten without salt? Or is there any taste in the white of an egg? Such things as my soul refused to touch, as were sorrows, are my meat." And this is a curious little triplet. Job concludes his first argument by asking here a series of rhetorical questions, all aimed at the same thing. The gist of these questions is to make the point that when an animal or a person gets what they deserve or desire, they have no cause to complain. A donkey does not complain when it gets grass to eat, and neither does an oxen complain, here they use the word loweth, when they have plenty of leaves, stalk, and grain. Similarly, people who eat salted meats or whole eggs rarely complain. It is when animals or people do not get what they expect when they complain, that they complain. So here Job ends his argument. Job has not received what he expects. This wrath of God is not proportionate to what he expects. If Job had scandalously sinned, he most certainly would have expected to suffer. But the severity of God's apparent wrath is disproportionate to the amount that Job suffers. Therefore, Job believes that he is justified in making his speech in chapter 3, and that it is his friends who err by not fully understanding the scope and nature of his suffering. So he's defended his first charge, that he can't comfort himself. He said, I have a right to complain. We come to our second point, verses 8 through 23. Job defends against the charge of wishing for his own death. Verses 8 to 10. "Oh, that I might have my desire, and that God would grant me the thing that I long for. That is, that God would destroy me, that he would let his hand go and cut me off. Then should I yet have comfort, though I burn with sorrow, let him not spare, because I have not denied the words of the Holy One." In Job's former speech, chapter 3, he was very careful not to wish for death. He wished the day of his birth had never occurred, or that he had died at birth, but now he asks for death. Job gives no thought to suicide, for he recognizes that his life is in God's hands, for good or ill. If he is to die, and that is his sincere desire, it must be God who strikes the blow. God has created this kind of existence for Job. It is God, not Job, who must bring it to an end. Job's desire to die does not come from anger or envy, as accused by Eliphaz. Rather, Job sees his only hope in death. He sees his situation on earth as hopeless. Eliphaz and friends envision a hope for Job's prosperous future, chapter 4, verse 6. Or they even envision for Job a reversal of fortune, chapter 5, verse 16. But Job's hope is for death. Job can no longer see any possibility of life with God. The near presence of God, that is. He does not understand the reason behind his cruel existence. But it would miss the point entirely to believe that Job is angry with God. It is just the opposite. In death, all will be made right with God. In death, Job will be restored to his family. It is not the physical suffering that plagues Job. It is the not knowing why he is physically suffering. In death, he will know. That's why he wants it. All will make sense, and he will be restored to the perfect near presence of God, which he misses more than anything. Something that he dearly misses. Death is an end to his physical and psychological suffering. In death, he will be restored to the right presence of God. So he begs God for a merciful end, that God would destroy me. Death would be to Job a comfort and a friend. Yet there is another element at play in these words. Job's life is like a prisoner under torture here. And this is the whole crux of the passage here. In a sense, he wishes to die before he breaks. So when he cries for God to take his life, it's a righteous cry. For he fears denying God more than he fears his own death. And he's wearing out. He's afraid he's going to deny God. Job fears losing his integrity, not his life. And for this, he's heroic. To want to die before he loses his integrity is heroic. When he spoke these words, he could still say, I have not denied the words of the Holy One, but he feels himself slipping and he wants his life taken from him before he slips. Verses 11 through 13. What power have I that I should endure? Or what is mine end if I should prolong my life? Is my strength the strength of stones, or is my flesh of brass? Is it not so that there is in me no help, and that strength is taken from me? For Job, dying is easy. It is the power or strength to endure or to be patient in suffering that he finds difficult. He asked, what is mine end? In other words, what is my limit? How much longer must I endure when I have nothing to hope for? What event lays in the future that gives his life any meaning? Job asks rhetorically, do I have the strength of stones or brass? In other words, am I like a stone with no feeling whatsoever? And therefore, like a stone, my strength always remains? Or am I not flesh and blood, which physically suffers? Job says his flesh is not made of brass that can be heated and melted and feels no pain. Job concludes here that he has no power for patience, verse 11, and no strength in body or soul, verse 12. And in reality, he has no strength of any kind. It is as though his strength has been driven from him, or the Greek word pressed from him, taken from him, by an external power. All Job knows is that his body is in such a state of weakness with no energy that it is a match for death. Verse 14. He that is in misery ought to be comforted of his neighbor, but men have forsaken the fear of the Almighty. Job is disappointed that his friends have failed to understand the scope of his emotions, why he really wants to die. Job cites their disloyalty. He's looking for them to take his side. One might even say against God, but that's not really what he means. Job is innocent before God, and these friends have in a sense sided with God's wrath, when in fact Job has done nothing to deserve God's wrath. Therefore they have sided not with God, but with an error that they have attributed to God. Where there is no truth, there is no fear of the Almighty. And where there is error, there is no fear of the Almighty. Therefore, Job can conclude that their advice, because it lacks wisdom, must also lack the fear of God. Verses 15 to 17. This is a little metaphor to help us understand something. My brethren have deceived me as a brook, and as the rising of the rivers they pass away, which are blackish with ice and wherein the snow is hid. But in time they are dried up with heat and are consumed, and when it is hot they fail out of their places. In this, the first of two triplets in this section, Job compares his friend's loyalty with that of a body of water in the desert, where water cannot be relied upon in any season. The comparison here is deep and specific. During the rainy season, the waters of Palestine are overflowing when their water is not needed. When it is needed during the dry season, it has nothing to offer. Such are Job's friends. The image is expanded to include the desert water in winter and in summer. Winter transforms the water dark with ice. The text says blackish with ice, and swollen with melted snow. In the summer, the water retreats into channels and eventually dries up when it is most needed. So Job's friends here are compared to the river, unreliable, speaking when they should be silent and silent to what they should speak. Verse 18, or they depart from their way and course, yea, they vanish and perish. Job here continues the metaphor of the useless river. He mentions that caravans of merchants during the summertime are often tempted to stray from their regular path to find the water they saw in the winter. But they lose their way, searching for these dry streams, and they perish in the desert before they can find water. Verse 19 and 20 expands on that. They, that is the caravans, they that go to Tema considered them, and they that go to Sheba waited for them. But they were confounded when they hoped. They came thither and were ashamed. Job expands his analogy of the unreliable river and caravans in these two verses in more specific terms. He mentions caravans that once traveled from the two most famous trading centers, Tema and Sheba. Even the most experienced travelers can be confounded by the missing water that they had hopes to find. They comforted themselves with the hope of water and found their hope vain and false. Verse 21, now Job explains this whole extended metaphor. Surely now are ye like unto it. Ye have seen my fearful plague and are afraid. Now Job here ends his comparison. His friends are not only unreliable and inconsistent like the river, verses 15 and 17, he has found himself deceived by them, such as the caravan was deceived in 18 to 20, by the false hopes of finding water. Job suffers like these travelers in the desert, not only disappointed of expectation, but a danger to life. Job knows why they have adopted this position. They are convinced that Job is plagued for some sinful knowledge, and they fear aligning themselves with Job, lest they share the same fate as Job. They are afraid that anyone siding with one who is suffering under God's displeasure may themselves incur God's wrath. Job concludes this section by saying, was it because I said, bring unto me, or give a reward to me of your substance, and deliver me from the enemy's hands, or ransom me out of the hand of the tyrants? Job asks, why are you afraid of me? Is it because you fear that I might ask you for money or food and decrease your estates? Or have I asked you to take up arms for me and retrieve my lost and stolen goods from my enemies, as did Abraham for Lot? Or was I taken prisoner and asked you to come pay some rich ransom for my release? If Job had asked for such thing, it's possible that his friends could have been offended, for Job might have been asking too much. But Job did not ask for any of these things. He merely asked for their loyalty and comfort of his friends during an extremely difficult trial. But he cannot get so much as a soft word on his behalf. Rather, he gets accusations and false opinions that increase his suffering. This and all his former arguments, here in verses 8 to 23, serve as Job's defense in explaining why he spoke so rashly and why he continues to maintain his innocence against his miserable comforters. And now we come to the final verses, verses 24 to 29. Job defends against the charge that he denied God's justice. Verse 24, Job is speaking now to his friends directly. Teach me, and I will hold my tongue, and cause me to understand wherein I have erred. If his friends are so sure of their criticism and aware of Job's secret sins, Job says, let them speak them out loud. Let his friends tell Job exactly what he did to warrant the wrath of God. Now Job speaks directly here without any imagery. All this time it has been assumed that the guilt in question is the crime for which Job is suffering. The wrongdoing which Eliphaz insists lies at the basis of Job's present predicament. Job comes directly to the point. Wherein have I erred? What exactly is my sin? Verse 12 to 25 to 27, Job says, how steadfast are the words of righteousness, and what can any of you justly reprove? Do you imagine to reprove words that the talk of the afflicted should be as the wind? Ye make your wrath to fall upon the fatherless and dig a pit for your friend. Up to this point, the charge of sin against Job has been nothing more than vague generalities, nothing specific. Eliphaz has never been specific, and so for all his talk, he has never entertained the idea that Job might be innocent and not under the wrath of God and being unjustly treated by his three friends. The theme of this triplet, verses 25 through 27, is words. The words of truth or solid argument have a marvelous power to convert or convince a person. But Job says his friend's words have done nothing to persuade or reprove him. Job asks, "Do ye imagine to reprove words, or do you think your words, Eliphaz, carry weight and truth, and that my words," the words of Job, "are light and lacking substance as the wind?" Job says, "Do you see no reason behind my words? Are they merely the vain words of an afflicted or desperate, or what we might call today a crazy man?" Job says that the words of Eliphaz, speaking for his friends, are harmful. They do not comfort, but they are cruel. Job uses here two proverbs to describe their hard-heartedness. He says their behavior is more like those who sell orphans and exploit a profit from the misfortunes of a child who loses his parents. Or their cruelty rivals that of one who pretends to be a friend, but under disguise of friendship, they ensnare or trap him. That's what he means by dig a pit for your friend. Verses 28 and 29 in conclusion. "Now therefore, says Job, be content to look upon me, for I will not lie before your face. Turn, I pray you, let there be none iniquity. Return, I say, and ye shall see yet my righteousness in that behalf. Is there iniquity in my tongue? Doth my mouth feel sorrows?" Job asks his friend to now treat him as a friend should, and to look at Job, or as we might say, look me in the eye. "See if I appear to be lying," says Job. "Do I look like one who speaks and acts in fear or guilt?" Job pleads for them to reconsider their line of reasoning. He has been disappointed with them, that they cannot recognize his innocence. Job swears that if they will listen a second time or retry his case for a second time, he will not lie to them. Job asks them to turn from their former thought that Job was a hypocritical sinner to the truth, which is that Job is a guiltless sufferer. Job says that he alone has discovered the true flavor of his misfortune. As one uses the tongue to judge flavor in food, Job says that he tastes or judges his own cause fairly. He alone is in position to judge whether he has just cause for complaint, and he is best qualified to know whether he is speaking the truth. For he alone knows his own mind, something his friends cannot know. Job must make his friends see his situation accurately, so that they might see him in a new and accurate light, as an innocent sufferer whose words have not challenged the justice of God, but merely defended his own innocence. And so Job here has argued for his innocence. He does not believe that he has overreacted in his actions or his words. He believes that due to his heightened calamity, his words are consistent with an innocent sufferer. He denies that he has challenged the justice of God, but maintains whatever are God's reasons for his affliction, it cannot be his hypocritical walk before God. Job continues to maintain his innocence and chides his friends for their bad counsel. Job's friends clearly overstep their boundaries by pretending to have knowledge of some sin of Job, which they insist he refuses to admit. Job here rightly